Hello and welcome. On today's video, I want to discuss one of the Buddha's most famous early similes, the simile of the handful of leaves. This is perhaps one of the Buddha's most famous and incisive early similes, and it's one that distinguishes the Buddha from many other ancient teachers. If you're new to this channel of mine, by the way, and would like to live a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel. And click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. And when we're trying to find wisdom like this, trying to find ways to live calmer and wiser and more peaceful lives, I think this simile can play a really central role because it can take our minds off of things that are unimportant. Now, to begin with, what is the simile? What I'll do is to look at the early text where we see the simile, and it says there, "The Buddha picked up a few rosewood leaves in his hand and addressed the mendicants," that is, the monastics. "What do you think, mendicants? Which is more, the few leaves in my hand, or those in the forest above me?" "Sir, the few leaves in your hand are a tiny amount. There are far more leaves in the forest above." "In the same way, there is much more that I have directly known but have not explained to you. What I have explained is a tiny amount." Now, as I say, this is one of the most famous and incisive of the Buddha's early similes, and it distinguishes him from some ancient teachers, teachers of his day. Here I'm thinking of people like Aristotle, perhaps even like Plato, who set themselves up as people who, at least potentially, knew an enormous amount about the entire world. And indeed, much of the knowledge that they claim to have has subsequently been shown to be faulty or irrelevant in various ways. On the other hand, in several early suttas, the Buddha does set himself up as being a much more pragmatic kind of teacher, somebody who's really interested in focusing on what's most important to the ends of the teaching rather than getting lost in other kinds of speculations. Now, I say in certain early suttas, and I'll get back to that in a little bit. Indeed, in this sutta and in the Sutta of the Poisoned Arrow, the Buddha sets himself up as essentially being a pragmatist. That is to say that he teaches for practical ends. His teaching is supposed to achieve a particular kind of end. He's not simply teaching in order to express various theoretical possibilities, in order to demonstrate his knowledge of all kinds of arcane facts, in order to satisfy any number of theoretical ends that we might have. In much of philosophy, as it's practiced around the world, that is the aim. In other words, the aim is quite general, to know all of what we can know. Whereas for the Buddha, again, his aims, at least in these two suttas and certain other ones, is essentially pragmatic. It's focused on a particular kind of end. I have a video about the simile of the poisoned arrow, and I'll leave a link to that video down below if you don't know that one. The Buddha goes on to say that the reason that he doesn't teach about all the leaves in the trees and only teaches the material in his hand is because that other material is not beneficial or relevant to the fundamentals of the spiritual life. It doesn't lead to disillusionment, dispassion, cessation, peace, insight, awakening, and extinguishment. That is to say that the Buddha's teaching is aimed at the ending of dukkha, at the ending of suffering, at the ending of our sense of unsatisfactoriness with the world. It's not aimed at giving us a complete picture of the world, because much of that picture would involve irrelevancies. Now, if we get into much later Buddhist theorizing, we will find very, very extensive and compendious and theoretically even potentially complete pictures of cosmology, of the world, of the way things are. In many ways, that's at least one way to understand what was going on in the Abhidharma, and it's one way to understand much of what's going on in later Buddhist theory. But we might then say that, well, okay, that later Buddhist theory and the Abhidharma and so on, that they're not really following the Buddha's lead, that they're not really in the spirit that the Buddha taught, that the Buddha was much more pragmatic than those later teachings. And I think to an extent that's right, The pragmatism of the early teachings is really what distinguishes them in many ways from what came after. But I don't think we should push that too far, because indeed there are many quite speculative passages in the early teachings as well. There is much about cosmology, about general theory, about various matters in the early teaching that we might think strays quite a bit from the pragmatism that we find expressed in suttas like the one that I just mentioned, or the two that I've just mentioned here in this video. So, and indeed I've done earlier videos about those kinds of more speculative aspects of early Buddhism, for example, aspects involving the various realms of existence. That's one example, sort of a Buddhist cosmology, which is indeed expressed in several early suttas. Now, we might guess that perhaps these more speculative suttas of the Buddha, where he discusses cosmology and such things, that they perhaps post-date him, that maybe they were written after he was alive and that he didn't actually compose them. That's something that I tend to doubt. It's also possible that they stem from a different part of his teaching career. That is to say that he may have begun by teaching in a more pragmatic way, and as his many decades-long career continued, he got more speculative towards the end. There's no way to know for sure, but we can look, for example, at Plato, who is somebody whose career followed just such a kind of line, where earlier on in Plato's career, he was much more skeptical in a sort of an ironic way, and later on became much more interested in issues of, let's say, cosmology, the bigger kinds of questions. There's no way to know this for sure. It's also quite possible that from the very beginning, the Buddha felt that a general knowledge of cosmology was indeed important and perhaps essential for enlightenment in order for us to understand certain things. Indeed, many contemporary practitioners believe that nowadays, that the aspects of cosmology that the Buddha discussed, these more speculative aspects, are essential to his teaching. And indeed, they might have been, or at least he might have felt that they were. It's, again, difficult to say for sure. And this does also raise the question as to the Buddha's supposed omniscience. In much of the later Buddhist tradition, it's believed that the Buddha was, in some sense, literally omniscient. That is to say that he knew all things, even if perhaps he may not have known them all at once. At least it's conceivable on this understanding of the Buddha that given any fact, he would have known it if he were asked. That's the way some Buddhists think of the Buddha's knowledge. Now, and I should also say that this text that we've been looking at, the text on the handful of leaves, doesn't really solve that problem one way or the other, because it certainly sounds from that text as though the Buddha knows indeed quite a lot. Nevertheless, many early texts belie the claim that the Buddha was literally omniscient, since there seem to be various things that the Buddha didn't know about when they happened. And indeed, I did an earlier video on the question of the Buddha's omniscience. If you haven't seen it or would like to see it again, I'll leave a link to it up here on the screen. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look over at my Patreon page and helping support the work that I'm doing here and that we're doing together. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.